This is my dad, Earl Root, and his father's name was Earl Root. During World War II, he married Alice Pleer, and together they ran a mom-and-pop grocery store from 1955 to 1965. It doesn't exist anymore, so here's my poor rendition. This is literally the story of the Roots and family roots. May 11th, 1858, 3 years before the American Civil War, the territory of Minnesota became the 32nd state of the Union. Much of the western portion of Minnesota was not included in this effort, and that portion eventually became North and South Dakota. But in 1858, that area was identified as unorganized Dakota. On May 12th, the day after Minnesota's statehood, some 1,200 miles away, Maurice St. Hilaire was born to Pierre St. Hilaire and Carmelette Dupuis in Quebec, Canada. Pierre, born in 1833, was the son of Louis St. Hilaire and Adelaide Langlais. Pierre married Carmelette Dupuis, daughter of Josephine Napoleon Dupuis and Domitille Hilaire. Pierre married Carmelite in 1857, the same year he graduated from the Jacques Cartier School for Teachers. Maurice was the firstborn of 11 children to Pierre and Carmelite, from 1858 to 1882, a period of 22 years. 11 St. Hilaire children were pretty mobile after they grew up, with some of them making it all the way from Quebec on the east coast to California and Alberta on the west coast, and many made it to Minnesota. Pierre, his wife Carmelite, and baby Maurice, following his teaching jobs, moved from St. Valentin to La Prairie in 1860, about 75 miles away. 10 years later, they were living in Napierville, about 22 miles from La Prairie. Eventually, Pierre settled in St. Chrysostome, where he taught and retired to farming around 1890. Pierre St. Hilaire died in 1905. Carmelite passed away in 1908, and to date we have not found her headstone. In 1535, Jacques Cartier voyaged across the Atlantic Ocean and claimed the territory of New France. From that point on, French posts were created, and the French began to immigrate into the area, primarily for fishing and trapping. They aligned with some native tribes, but fought with others, primarily the Iroquois. They also had many land disputes and skirmishes with England, particularly in an area called Acadia, which eventually became Nova Scotia. Many French settlers left to return to Canada. Some poured into the United States, especially New Orleans and Louisiana. Others stayed to fight and keep their land. In 1756, the 7 Years' Global War engulfed the French and English. Canada was just one battleground. After the English won some decisive battles in Quebec and Montreal, the French formally ceded the land to England in 1763. But the seeds of a bicultural nation were planted. In 1878, Maurice married a man named Telesphore Hebert. Maurice was 20 years old and Telesphore was 29. Telesphore came from a family of 15 from Napierville, Quebec. Telesphore was dashing. He had a profession as wagon builder, but had little means. Maurice's father, Pierre, wrote a letter of advice to her a month before the marriage in September of 1878. You speak of marriage. It is natural. It is an act of human life, which is of very great importance. It is unique with good and bad times, present and future. That is why it is wise to think ahead of time, not only to consult your passion, which overpowers, but of wisdom, discretion, and experience. You love him without a doubt, Mr. Telesphore Hebert, whom you were destined to meet. He is without wealth, which I do not consider important. Money will not bring happiness. He is poor, but honest and of good character, sober and industrious. I have no objections to him becoming your husband and my son. In 1878, 5 months before the marriage of Maurice and Telesphore, back in Minnesota, an event would occur that would shape the destiny of the state. It became known as the Great Mill Disaster, and within 2 years, Minneapolis had turned from a lumber town to a world leader in flour production. The confluence of lumber, milling, and railroads created a population boom. Telesphore, we'll call him TP from this point on, and Maurice came down to live in Minneapolis in 1882, probably by train. Perhaps they were lured by promotional posters, gainful employment, or perhaps it was the stories of Pierre, who at the adventurous age of 13 followed a friend down to La Crosse, Wisconsin, across the river from Minnesota Territory. Pierre lived in La Crosse from 1846 to 1854. According to family history, Pierre stayed long enough to forget his French and had to relearn when he went back to Quebec. TP found employment as a pattern maker for Prey Manufacturing from 1882 until it went out of business in 1886. TP then went to work for Diamond Iron Works, where he worked until 1917. Business, family, and a strong French community enticed much of Pierre and Carmelite's family to come to Minneapolis and Minnesota. Circa 1983, Pierre Jr., who was known as Hilaire St. Hilaire, arrived and found work as a clerk in a clothing store in downtown Minneapolis. 1883, Marie-Louise St. Hilaire married Joseph Marcoux, an accountant from South Dakota, who opened a clothing and shoe store in northeast Minneapolis. They had 3 children in Minneapolis, but by 1900, they were living in Leeds, South Dakota, and eventually wound up in California. 1889, Louis St. Hilaire was an artist, and he opened a studio in downtown Minneapolis. He was commissioned to paint murals for Our Lady of Lourdes Church. He later went to Europe to study art and settled down in Quebec, where he continued to paint murals and paintings for churches and basilicas. 1898, Alcide and his twin brother Arthur were on a farm in Belle Prairie, Minnesota that was under Medrice's name. Eventually they packed it up and moved to farms near Prince Albert in Saskatchewan. Alexander, the youngest St. Hilaire, worked the farm in St. Chrysostome and then went to work a farm in Vermont before coming to Minneapolis circa 1902. He also traveled to Calgary, Saskatchewan, and back to Quebec before settling down in Minneapolis. Not everyone lived in Minnesota at some point in their lives. Leo, Ida, Wilfred, and Blanche may have visited, but they never moved to Minnesota. Leo St. Hilaire managed a farm in Quebec. Wilfred St. Hilaire was the first person to live and farm in Saskatchewan. Ida St. Hilaire eventually settled in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, and Blanche St. Hilaire moved to Vermont. Despite the many St. Hilaires who lived in Minnesota at certain times, only 3 stayed, raised a family, and died there: Medrice, Hilaire, and Alexander. 10 years before TP and Medrice arrived, Minneapolis had swallowed up St. Anthony, the little town that formed across the river from it. St. Anthony Falls was powerful enough to create 2 major industries, logging and milling, but it was not powerful enough to keep the name. First residence TP and Medrice moved into was 914 North 3rd Street, which is now known as the Warehouse District. We may never know what it looked like, but the original streets still exist. The residence was a half a mile from where Target Center sits today. In 1888, T.P. Hebert applied for a building permit for 1415 Grand Street Northeast, total cost of $1,000, which equates to $32,500 in 2025 currency. Here's the home in 1908. We'll name the names a little later on. The house is valued at over $440,000 today. 1415 Grand was a house and conduit for many Hebert and St. Hilaire activities, nestled in a French neighborhood named after Pierre Bottineau and anchored by Our Lady of Lourdes Church and Catholic School. Telesphore P. Hebert. What did the P stand for? Let's look at the Hebert line. Hebert is the 5th most common Acadian name, and TP's line was very prolific. He had 11 siblings, 10 aunts and uncles, and his father was David Hebert. His grandfather was Pierre, and we're pretty sure the P comes from Pierre. And speaking of prolific, let's take a look at the children and grandchildren of Pierre and Carmelite.
Echo de l'Ouest.
If you can ever get your hands on or online access to the French newspaper Echo of the West, it will be worth it. And it is also written in French. Saint Hilaire and Hebert weddings, deaths, parties, visits from relatives, business trips, they were all thoroughly covered by the Echo. At its height, the paper had 5,000 subscribers and ran from 1883 to 1929. In 1888, Stella Marie Antoinette Hebert was the third child born to Madrice and T.P. She eventually became a seamstress and worked at the Nicollet Hotel in downtown Minneapolis. This is where we believe she met Earl Root, and the two got married in 1911. These were the French-Canadian roots to my family.
Tweet, 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 tweet.